Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something everyone can relate to, food. But not the kind that comes with a tracking number and a sad paper napkin. No, tonight we're traveling back to medieval Europe, a time when dinner was more of a gamble than a guarantee, and flavor was something that happened to other people. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. No pressure. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fun to see who's falling asleep with me around the world. Now dim the lights, fluff that pillow, maybe turn on a soft fan for that background hum, and let's gently settle into the sleepy world of terrifying medieval cuisine. Because in this episode we're asking the important questions. What was pottage? Why did medieval bread sometimes try to kill you? What's it like to drink beer for breakfast? And how did anyone survive long enough to invent cheese? We'll explore food myths, strange truths, royal feasts, peasant stews, and the occasional hallucinogenic rye loaf. Along the way, we'll discover why some meals were sacred, others suspicious, and a few should never have happened in the first place. So pull up a hay bale, grab your wooden spoon, and let's begin tonight's journey with a hearty helping of history, a pinch of plague, and absolutely no hand sanitizer. If you were to walk into a medieval kitchen, and I use the term kitchen very loosely here, you'd probably encounter one smell: a thick, warm, somewhat unplaceable aroma. Not quite stew, not quite regret. That's pottage. Pottage was not just a dish, it was a lifestyle. A bubbling cauldron of hope, desperation, and whatever was growing, crawling, or not too moldy that week. Picture a pot that never gets fully emptied, just topped up endlessly with new ingredients, like a culinary compost pile, but one you eat. The base was simple: water, grains, and whatever root vegetables you hadn't already burned, bartered, or buried in the garden for safekeeping. Turnips were common, not because they were delicious, but because they were stubborn. You could neglect a turnip for a month, and it would still show up to dinner. On good days, your pottage might include onions, leeks, maybe a carrot if the local rabbits hadn't unionized. On great days, someone tossed in a bone, not for the meat, that was long gone, but for the illusion of flavor. The bone was basically the medieval version of a seasoning packet. And spices? Absolutely not. A single pinch of black pepper could cost more than a week's wages. So instead, people used things like parsley, garlic, or wild herbs. Or they just said a little prayer and hoped it tasted less like mud than usual. Now, pottage wasn't just poor man's soup. Everyone ate it, from peasants to monks. Even the wealthy had their own upscale versions, with meat, spices, almonds, and a complete lack of fungal side effects. But for most folks, pottage was survival. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and possibly dessert if you stirred in some apples and didn't think too hard about the bits. The pot itself sat on the hearth, day and night. It was never washed, just replenished, which means that on any given day, your spoon might hit something from last week, last month, or Great Aunt Mildred's wedding feast. Some historians even call pottage the eternal stew, because in some homes the same pot was in use for years. Years! Like a sourdough starter, but with less Instagram appeal and more botulism risk. But here's the strange thing: pottage kinda worked. It was warm, filling, and relatively nutritious, assuming it didn't come with bonus bacteria. It was also incredibly social. Stirring the pot, sharing a bowl, dunking a crust of bread. This was daily life. Messy, communal, and mildly horrifying by modern standards. So next time you microwave some leftover soup and wonder if it's still good, just remember, in medieval Europe, age was a seasoning. Ah, bread, the so-called staff of life. The cornerstone of civilization, the thing that makes toast possible. Now imagine that same bread, but made of ground bark, dust, and possibly mild hallucinations. Welcome to medieval baking. Let's start with the basics. For most people, bread wasn't just food, it was the meal. especially for peasants. You'd get a hunk of bread in the morning, maybe dip it in your pottage, and chew it thoughtfully until your jaw gave out. That same loaf would be recycled for lunch and dinner, and maybe used to patch the roof if things got bad enough. But don't imagine fluffy white loaves or crusty artisan sourdoughs. Medieval bread was dense, dark, and occasionally dangerous. It was usually made from barley, rye, or oats, because wheat was the Beyoncé of grains, loved by all, affordable to none. In lean years, bakers got creative, and by creative, I mean desperate. They'd stretch flour by adding ground peas, lentils, acorns, ferns, or good old-fashioned dirt. Some even used clay, which really puts a new spin on the phrase earthy flavor. And then there was the ergot problem. Sounds like a fantasy villain, right? But ergot was a fungus that grew on rye in damp conditions, which coincidentally described 90% of Europe. If you ate infected bread, you might experience convulsions, hallucinations, gangrene, or spontaneous outbreaks of dancing until death. Yes, that really happened. It was called St. Vitus, dance, and it made pottage look downright safe. Even the church knew bread was risky. They blessed it. They wrote prayers for it. Because nothing says bon appetit like Lord. Please, let this loaf not be possessed by fungal demons. Now, if you were wealthy, your bread came from refined wheat flour. It was soft, white, and required zero dental insurance. This is where the term upper crust comes from, literally. The top part of the loaf was considered the best, while peasants got the bottom, which was closer to the ash, dirt, and occasional cockroach. But despite its flaws, bread was life. It filled stomachs. It carried stew. It absorbed wine. And if you were lucky enough to own a bit of land or have baking rights, it gave you independence. Still, it's fair to say that some medieval bread bit back. And if you didn't know where your loaf came from, or what was in it, you might find yourself praying, hallucinating, or inventing modern dentistry a few centuries early. Imagine waking up parched, reaching for a glass of water, and then deciding, you know what, let's just go with beer. Congratulations, you're officially medieval. Now, before you picture knights cracking open a cold one at dawn, let's clarify. This wasn't the kind of beer you'd find at a bar. This was small beer, a low-alcohol, barely hoppy brew that was just safe enough to drink without immediately dying. You see, water in medieval towns was suspicious at best and weaponized at worst. Streams doubled as sewers. Wells were open invitations for dead rodents. Rain barrels? They were home to birds, bugs, and the occasional unlucky toad. Basically, if the water looked clear, it was lying. So people turned to beer. Because the brewing process, boiling, fermenting, filtering, actually killed off most of the nasty stuff. Was it delicious? Not really. Was it effective? Arguably. Was it better than cholera? Definitely. Everyone drank it. Adults, elders, children, even nuns. Monasteries brewed their own and often became the local version of Starbucks, minus the foam art, and with slightly more chanting. But beer wasn't just for hydration. It was part of your daily calories. A pint of small beer could carry more nutrition than your entire breakfast, which, as we've established, probably involved chewing something that once saw daylight 6 months ago. And it was cheap to make: barley, water, and thyme. You didn't need hops. Those came later, mostly because someone decided beer should stop tasting like fermented porridge. Until then, it was all trial, error, and burping. Of course, the rich had options. They drank stronger ales, wines, even imported goods like mead or spiced mulled wine. Their hydration choices were basically status symbols. The more exotic your beverage, the higher your social rank, and the more likely you were to need dental work. But for most people, beer was survival. It kept the thirst at bay, the stomach half full, and the parasites politely uninvolved. Plus, it was probably safer than the goat milk. So the next time someone side-eyes your morning coffee habit, just remember, your ancestors were drinking beer at breakfast and nobody judged them. While peasants gnawed on barky bread and dreamed of semi-fresh root vegetables, the nobility were busy turning dinner into performance art. Because if you were rich in the Middle Ages, food wasn't just food. It was status, spectacle, and an open invitation to gout. A medieval feast wasn't about satisfying hunger. It was about reminding everyone that you, unlike most of the population, had options. And servants. And a roast swan, dressed in its own feathers, just for decoration. Let's start with the menu. A typical royal banquet could include dozens of dishes, served in elaborate courses that had little to do with logic and everything to do with showing off. You might start with a peacock. Yes, peacock. Cooked, then redressed in its original feathers, posed with a lemon in its beak like some kind of exotic, slightly judgmental centerpiece. There were also pies filled with live birds, pastries shaped like castles, and sometimes entire animals stuffed with smaller animals, like some sort of meat-based nesting doll. Ever heard of a roast boar stuffed with a goose, stuffed with a chicken, stuffed with an egg? That wasn't dinner. That was a challenge. And the spices. Oh, the spices. Where a peasant's entire year might pass without seeing so much as a grain of pepper, the nobles hoarded cinnamon, cloves, saffron, and anything that smelled like money. In fact, spices were so expensive they were locked in tiny chests and counted like jewels, which makes sense because by weight, some were literally worth more than gold. Drinks flowed freely. Imported wines, spiced meads, and strong ales. And let's not forget hippocras, a wine mixed with sugar and spices, filtered through cloth, and served as a sort of medieval dessert smoothie. It sounds fancy until you realize it was basically grape Kool-Aid for lords. Entertainment was included. Between courses, guests enjoyed jesters, dancers, poets, musicians, and occasionally trained bears. Because nothing pairs with roast heron like mild bear anxiety. But not everything was edible. Some dishes were entirely decorative, sculpted from sugar, fat, or dough into intricate castles, animals, or moral allegories, like a jelly in the shape of a church, to remind you that gluttony was a sin after dessert. And yet, for all this excess, there were no forks. Most nobles used knives and fingers. Your sleeve doubled as a napkin. And you shared a drinking cup with your neighbor, who might be a bishop, a baron, or someone with medieval-grade halitosis. Ah, the glamour. Still, for the elite, food wasn't just nourishment. It was power, ritual, politics, and the occasional food fight. To eat lavishly was to be seen. To be seen was to rule. And to be the kitchen boy cleaning up goose bones until midnight? Well, that's another story. In modern life, poaching means gently simmering eggs or stealing business secrets. In the Middle Ages, poaching meant tiptoeing into a forest at night to chase down your dinner and possibly getting executed for it. Welcome to the wild world of medieval food laws, where a rabbit could get you hanged and a squirrel was technically political property. Here's the deal. Almost all the good hunting grounds belonged to someone with a title. If it had trees, deer, or anything remotely edible, it was claimed by the local lord, baron, or king, usually marked with signs that said something like, "Trespassers will be significantly dead." And we're not talking lions and bears here. The animals in question were rabbits, pheasants, fish, squirrels, and other small woodland delicacies. If you were poor, hungry, and dared to catch one, that was poaching, and it was a criminal offense. Punishments ranged from fines to mutilation to death, depending on your status and the mood of the judge. Some poachers had their ears cut off as a warning. Others lost hands. A few lost everything, except maybe the squirrel they risked it all for. But here's the twist. Everyone poached. Because legally or not, people needed to eat. So poaching became a kind of underground profession. Skilled poachers were stealthy, fast, and knew the woods better than the gamekeepers hired to catch them. Think of them as the Robin Hoods of roast dinner, minus the tights and PR team. They used nets, snares, slingshots, and sheer audacity. Sometimes they smeared themselves in mud to hide their scent, or wore soft shoes to silence their steps. Getting caught meant disaster, but not poaching meant starvation. So people gambled. The irony? Many of the animals deemed protected were introduced by the rich for sport, like rabbits, which were imported and farmed in warrens, then guarded by armed men to make sure you didn't swipe one for your turnip stew. And if you were caught poaching a deer, forget it. That was a capital offense. Deer were royal game, and harming one was practically treason. It was like slapping the king with a meat pie. Of course, nobles had no such limits. They hunted freely, often with huge entourages, trained hounds, and a picnic ready. Meanwhile, peasants were hiding behind bushes with homemade slings, hoping nobody heard the thud. So next time you see a cute rabbit hopping through the grass, remember, in medieval times, that bunny might be the most controversial thing in the forest and the most dangerous to catch. In today's world, cheese is a delicacy, a charcuterie board staple, a topic of intense debate in online food forums. But in medieval Europe, cheese was less aged artisan delight and more whatever didn't rot into a biohazard first. Let's begin with the basics. Milk went bad fast. Like same day bad, especially when you're storing it in a clay pot beside a smoky hearth next to a snoring goat. So what did medieval folks do? They made cheese. Constantly. Bad milk, cheese. Surplus milk, cheese. Questionable milk, cheese. And possibly a prayer. Cheese was a preservation method, not a luxury. It extended the life of milk from hours to weeks, or even months, assuming mice, mold, or Cousin Ethel didn't get to it first. But here's the thing. Medieval cheese was not your supermarket brie. It was hard, crumbly, and often smelled like betrayal. Fresh cheeses like curds and soft farmer's cheese were eaten quickly. Aged cheeses, the good ones, were rare, heavily salted, and often came with a side of surprise. The process? Simple. Leave milk out, wait for it to curdle, strain it through a cloth, press the solids, salt it heavily, hope for the best. Occasionally, monks would get fancy. They'd age their cheeses in caves or smear them with herbs. These were the original cheese influencers. And yes, there were cheese taxes. In some places, peasants were required to hand over a portion of their cheese production to local lords. So you could milk your cow, curdle your milk, strain your curds, press them into a half-moldy brick, and then watch someone else eat it. Different regions developed their own cheeses. English Cheshire, French Cantal, Italian Pecorino, all rustic, firm, and designed to survive a long wagon ride and possibly a siege. These weren't for melting. These were for chewing slowly and thinking about mortality. And remember, no refrigeration, so cheese aged whether you wanted it to or not. Some went moldy, some dried into cheese jerky, and some just liquefied. That was called lost to the ages. But despite its flaws, cheese was vital. It provided protein. It lasted through the winter. It paired well with hard bread and despair. And for many medieval folks, it was the closest they got to a reliable food source that didn't involve boiling something until it wept. So next time you enjoy a delicate wedge of camembert, spare a thought for the medieval cheesemaker hunched over a smelly vat, muttering prayers to Saint Lactose. Ah, fruit. Crisp, juicy, refreshing. Unless, of course, you lived in medieval Europe, in which case fruit was mostly a seasonal gamble, with a high risk of worms and low expectations of freshness. First, let's establish something obvious. No fridges, no freezers, not even a lukewarm cellar unless you were rich and your castle didn't leak. So unless you ate your apples right off the tree or your pears before they squished themselves into mush, your options were limited. That's why most fruit in the Middle Ages was fermented, dried, baked, stewed, or aggressively turned into alcohol. If it couldn't be eaten immediately, it was better off drowning in wine or buried in pastry. Let's talk about apples. They were everywhere. And by everywhere we mean growing in slightly cursed orchards and full of bugs. The solution? Make cider. A delicious, mildly alcoholic drink that doubled as hydration and a socially acceptable breakfast. Children drank it. Monks made it. Peasants survived on it. It was the medieval smoothie. Pears, same story. Eaten fresh if you were lucky. Poached in wine if you were fancy. Or turned into a gritty sort of pear jam that no one really liked but everyone tolerated because, hey, it wasn't turnips, cherries, plums, berries. All lovely in theory and great for a week in July. After that, dried, mashed, or jammed into a pie crust and baked until they surrendered. Preservation was key, flavor was optional. And then there were figs, dates, and raisins, the exotic imports loved by the rich and hoarded like edible treasure. These weren't just fruits, they were statements. Look at me, I have a raisin. I'm basically royalty. The church even used them in desserts and ceremonial feasts, because nothing says holy reverence like a good fig cake. But most importantly, fruit was never just eaten casually. It was medicine, symbol, and mystery. Some thought apples cooled the body. Others believed peaches caused fevers. Melons were said to throw your humors out of balance. And if you dared to eat a banana in the 14th century, people might accuse you of witchcraft, or worse, being Italian. Even the humble grape didn't get a break. Grapes were either turned into wine, raisins, or theological metaphors. Drinking wine wasn't just fun, it was spiritual, which is a nice way of saying, I'm tipsy for the Lord. In short, fruit in the medieval diet was fleeting, symbolic, and frequently alcoholic. It wasn't an everyday snack, it was a seasonal event, a fermented gamble, or a luxury wrapped in mystery and theology. So the next time you bite into a cold, seedless grape from your well-lit fridge, remember, in the Middle Ages, that grape was probably already wine and someone's dinner. If you think monks spent all day quietly chanting in candlelit chapels, you're not wrong. But if you think they weren't secretly keeping detailed ledgers of what to eat, when to eat it, and whether that fish was morally acceptable, oh my dear listener, you are in for a treat. A very bland, heavily salted treat. Because to eat like a medieval monk was to follow a spiritual spreadsheet, one carefully calibrated to avoid gluttony, temptations of the flesh, and anything that tasted even remotely interesting. Let's start with fasting. Monks fasted. A lot. On Wednesdays, on Fridays, during Lent, Advent, Rogation Days, Ember Days. Random calendar events invented by someone who clearly hated breakfast. On fasting days, meat was off the table. Literally. In fact, most days, meat was off the table. Unless it was a feast day. Then, suddenly, all bets were off, and so were the belts. To replace meat, monks turned to fish. Glorious, biblical, occasionally suspicious fish. Cod, carp, eel, and the fan favorite, stockfish, which is like regular fish if it had been beaten with a hammer and left in the attic for 6 months. Tough, chewy, and resembling lightly salted bark, stockfish was a monk's best friend and worst enemy. And yes, eels were considered both nutritious and spiritually convenient. Monks loved eels. They were technically fish, easy to catch, and shaped like something that might appear in a medieval fever dream. They were baked in pies, stewed in broth, or simply eaten straight from the river with a look of mild regret. Then there were feast days, over 150 of them a year. On those days, the monastery dining hall turned into a liturgical buffet. Out came the cheese, the eggs, the good wine. Yes, monks made fantastic wine, and sometimes even meat. but only if it was a special saint, and only if the kitchen had a solid theological loophole. Now here's the twist. Monks weren't supposed to enjoy food. Gluttony was a sin, but, and this is important, the definition of gluttony was flexible. Eating too much was bad, but eating something elaborate, just in small portions, apparently that was fine. So monks wrote entire books on how to prepare food that was austere in theory, but delicious in practice, like almond milk soups, layered fish pies, fruit compotes, and beer brewed with secret herbs. Asceticism with a sprinkle of spice. Some monasteries even had 2 kitchens, one for regular meals and one for the sick, which conveniently served better food. And there were always a few monks mysteriously ill right around the feast of Saint Fatback. But here's the thing, monks weren't being hypocrites. Not really. They were trying to balance discipline with survival, devotion with nutrition. Their meals followed ritual, calendar, and spiritual intent. You didn't eat just to eat. You ate to live, to pray, and to not faint during Vespers. So if you ever feel guilty reaching for a second snack, remember, in the Middle Ages, even the holiest among us had cheat days, especially if those days involved eel pie. If medieval food had a celebrity guest star, it was spice. Not just for flavor, but for prestige, power, and occasionally starting wars. You see, in the Middle Ages, spice was less of a seasoning and more of a flex. To own spices, real ones, not the dried weeds growing behind your pig shed, was to say, I have connections, wealth, and the ability to make my turnips taste slightly less like sadness. Let's start with the headliners: pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, saffron, ginger. These weren't grown in medieval Europe. They came from India, Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, and North Africa, passing through endless trade routes, tax collectors, pirates, and questionable storage conditions before reaching your local noble's pantry. By the time a tiny pouch of cloves arrived, it might have cost more than a cow. A single nutmeg could buy you a week's wages. Saffron? That was the edible version of gold leaf, and often just as fake. Yes, spice fraud was a thing. Ground-up tree bark, brick dust, or dyed breadcrumbs were often sold as, quote, exotic blends. Medieval spice traders were basically the original herbal influencers. But why the obsession? Well, for starters, meat was not always fresh. And by not fresh, I mean possibly dead for some time before anyone noticed. Spices helped cover up the taste of regret. A heavily peppered stew didn't just warm your soul. It distracted you from the fact that the chicken may have died under suspicious circumstances. More importantly, spices had status. Nobles threw them around like glitter. Sugar, considered a spice at the time, was molded into sculptures. Cinnamon was brewed into wine. Cloves were studded into oranges and used as air fresheners. Even funerals sometimes involved spices. Not for the deceased, but for the guests. And in the kitchen, spices meant power. Cooks who understood spice blending, especially at royal courts, were revered. These weren't just chefs. They were flavor alchemists, making turnips taste like triumph and rice pudding taste like it hadn't been boiled by a monk. There were even laws about who could use certain spices, known as sumptuary laws. They restricted what different social classes could eat and wear. Because nothing says equality like, no nutmeg for you, peasant. Still, the demand for spices helped shape the world. The spice trade funded empires, built cities, and inspired exploration, colonization, and deeply questionable maps. All so someone could sprinkle a bit of cinnamon on their fig tart. So next time you casually add pepper to your eggs, remember, in the Middle Ages, that would have been a very fancy flex, and possibly the highlight of your entire month. So you've been invited to dinner at a medieval noble's hall. Congratulations! Now, try not to ruin everything by doing something offensive, like using a fork. Yes, Forks existed in medieval Europe, but early on they were seen as either suspiciously foreign, vain, or borderline sinful. Why use a tiny trident when God gave you fingers? So unless you're eating soup, in which case, use a spoon the size of a ladle. Expect to dine by hand. Now, let's run through the rest of the rules, shall we? Because while medieval folks didn't know about germs, they absolutely cared about etiquette, at least in theory. Rule 1. Don't lick your fingers. Wipe them on your napkin, or, if you're poor, on your tunic. But licking was frowned upon, unless you were very old, very young, or very drunk, which, to be fair, covered a lot of the population. Rule 2. No elbows on the table. Not because of manners, but because medieval tables weren't especially stable, and one wrong lean could collapse dinner for everyone. Rule 3. Share your trenchers. A trencher was a flat round of stale bread used as a plate. You shared it with your neighbor. After the meal, the trencher was often given to the poor, assuming your neighbor hadn't drooled on it too much. Think of it as early, biodegradable dishware, with an optional afterlife. Rule 4. Cut your meat small. No one wants to see you gnawing on a haunch like a barbarian. Well, maybe at a feast. But generally, neatness was prized. Slicing meat into manageable bits meant you were cultured. Also, you were less likely to choke in front of the bishop. Rule 5. Don't blow your nose in the tablecloth. This rule exists because, apparently, people needed to be told not to do it. Rule 6. Talk, but not too much. Polite conversation was encouraged. Topics like saints, land ownership, or why the other table's eel looked undercooked. Just avoid being too loud. And for heaven's sake, don't argue theology over pudding. It never ends well. Now, if you were eating with royalty, the rules multiplied. Servants announced the courses. Music played between dishes. Everyone waited for the king to eat first, and you never, ever reached across the table for more duck. That was a paddling offense. Sometimes, literally. For peasants, the etiquette was simpler. Don't eat your neighbor's bread unless they're unconscious. Don't make eye contact with the dog. And if someone drops a spoon, it's probably cursed now. Leave it. So yes, medieval people may have lived in drafty huts and eaten suspicious cheese, but when it came to dinner, they believed in rules, rituals, and not stabbing the table with your dagger unless absolutely necessary. In short, if you ever get invited to a medieval feast, don't bring a fork. Bring your best tunic, your smallest bites, and a healthy respect for ancient napkin hierarchy. In modern times, leftovers are a comforting thing. Last night's pasta, this morning's coffee, maybe a little something labeled, "Don't touch," and then immediately touched. But in the Middle Ages, leftovers weren't just food. They were a biological experiment. Let's start with the obvious. No refrigeration. If you made a stew on Monday and didn't eat it all, it stayed in the pot, on the hearth, for days, maybe a week, possibly longer. And every day, someone would just add more stuff. A bit of turnip, yesterday's bread, today's squirrel. Stir, boil, hope. This eternal stew strategy worked surprisingly well until it didn't, because bacteria doesn't care about hope or fasting days. It just shows up and throws a microscopic rave in your pottage. So how did people survive? One word: boiling, and lots of it. Before eating, food was reheated, often to a furious rolling boil, in an attempt to kill whatever had moved in overnight. Did it work? Sometimes. Did it also turn the food into mush that tasted like regret and overcooked onions? Almost always. If something really smelled off, people didn't throw it away. They spiced it, or doused it in vinegar, or just prayed harder. There was a whole theology of leftovers. If it didn't visibly bite back, it was still edible. Probably, the poor had no choice. Food waste was unthinkable. You ate everything, even if it had gone slightly off. That meat? Scrape the green part. That cheese? It's just enthusiastic. That bread? Chew fast and don't make eye contact. And remember, food poisoning was common and deadly. Salmonella wasn't just a bad night. It was a multi-day medieval adventure that could end in fever, hallucination, or a monk at your bedside making last rites awkward. Even among the rich, leftovers were a gamble. Sure, their pantries were better stocked and their cooks more skilled, but refrigeration was still a fantasy, and castles got warm in summer, very warm. Let's just say roasted goose doesn't age gracefully beside a roaring hearth and a collection of sweaty nobles. Still, some creative souls tried to preserve leftovers. They used salt, honey, vinegar, smoke, and sometimes just more bread. You could wrap meat in pastry, soak fruit in wine, or pack cheese in ashes. It wasn't perfect, but it was cheaper than replacing your dinner guests every week. So the next time you crack open your fridge, sniff some slightly expired hummus and toss it, just in case. Remember, your ancestors would have eaten it, blessed it, and gone back for seconds. Possibly with leeches. If you imagine medieval people clinking glasses and shouting, "Cheers," you're not entirely wrong. Except the glasses were wood, the contents were mildly suspicious, and the cheer was often followed by dysentery. Let's start with what they drank. Water was unreliable, as we've established. So people turned to beer, ale, cider, mead, wine, and anything else that had been boiled, fermented, or mildly blessed. Even children drank small beer, a low-alcohol brew, safer than the nearest stream. And wine was the beverage of the wealthy, imported, diluted, spiced, and stored in questionable barrels. Mead, fermented honey wine, was a favorite in some regions, both sweet and potent, perfect for wedding feasts or regrettable decisions. Now, about the toasts. Drinking was social, ritualistic, and often spiritually loaded. Before sipping, one might raise a cup and say "Wassil," an Old English toast meaning "be in good health." The proper response? Drink ale, meaning "I see your toast and raise you liver damage." Toasts were more than politeness, they were trust exercises. In a world without tamper-proof caps or food safety standards, drinking with someone meant believing they weren't trying to poison you. That's why people often drank from the same cup, to prove it was safe, or at least to die together. At feasts, cups were passed around, and certain guests had designated servers whose job was to guard the goblet, both from thieves and from your cousin Edgar, who got weird after 2 sips of mead. There were also drinking games, though not the kind with red solo cups, more like, who can recite the Psalms after 3 jugs of cider without falling into the fire pit? Spoiler, not Brother Thomas. Drinking vessels varied wildly. Nobles sipped from silver goblets or glass beakers, if they had the budget for such luxury and strong insurance policies. Peasants used wooden cups, ceramic jugs, or whatever was lying around and not already claimed by a goat. And yes, there were rules. You didn't toast with your left hand. It was the suspicious one. You didn't refuse a toast unless you were very ill or very rude. And if someone toasted you and you didn't drink, well, may the fleas of 1,000 pigs invade your tunic. Socially speaking, drinking could also be symbolic. Wine as the blood of Christ, mead for marital bliss, ale for bonding, and strong spirits for moments of, let's say, medieval courage. Like storming a castle. Or proposing. So, as we sip toward the end of our historical meal, it's worth remembering. To drink in the Middle Ages was to connect to your neighbor, your faith, and your immune system's wildest dreams. And if your ale tasted a little off, just toast again and hope the moldy bread you soaked in it covered the flavor. When we think of medieval meals, it's easy to picture noble banquets and peasant stews eaten in private little hovels. But here's a fun twist. Eating was often a public event, and privacy was for weirdos or monks. Let's start with peasant life, because that's where most people lived. Homes were small, really small, 1 or 2 rooms at most. If you had a table, it doubled as a workspace, laundry area, sleeping surface, and occasional chicken runway. So when dinner was ready, which usually meant stew is no longer cold, everyone gathered, including guests, neighbors, and any human-shaped creature passing by. Dining was communal, casual, and very much BYOB, bring your own bowl. Most peasants ate from a shared pot or trenchers, those edible bread plates we talked about earlier. Spoons were common, knives were personal. And if someone in your family owned an actual ceramic bowl, they were probably considered upper middle class by medieval standards, or dangerously extravagant. Now shift your gaze to the nobility, and things get even more public. Feasts weren't just for eating, they were performances. The lord or king ate on a raised platform, so everyone could see how regal he looked chewing. Below, guests were arranged by status. Closer to the lord? Congrats. You're important. Near the door? You might be a noble's cousin's scribe's nephew. Good luck getting a warm trencher. Meals were accompanied by music, gestures, and strategic social maneuvering. You weren't just eating, you were being seen eating. That was power. That was prestige. That was also exhausting. Etiquette was elaborate. You stood when the Lord entered. You didn't eat until he started. You bowed if you were served personally. You didn't cough near the meat course unless you wanted to be removed. And sharing a goblet with someone was practically a blood pact. But even outside of formal feasts, eating in public was normal. Travelers stopped at roadside inns, often little more than someone's home with extra soup and an extra bench. You'd share a table with strangers, sometimes with their dogs, sometimes with their fleas. Conversation flowed easily, mostly because people wanted to know who you were and whether you had lice. Markets and fairs also offered food on the go. Roasted chestnuts, small pies, chunks of cheese, ale from barrels, even fried fish if you were lucky. These early street food stalls were communal experiences. You stood, you ate, you dropped crumbs for the pigeons, and you hoped no one recognized you from last week's eel dispute. Even religious spaces had food rituals. Monasteries offered alms to the poor, which often included bread and weak beer. Pilgrims ate at roadside shrines. And during festivals, the whole village might eat together, seated in rows on long benches, slurping pottage like a medieval block party. Privacy, in short, was rare. Eating was communal, noisy, messy, and deeply social. If you ate alone, people worried. Were you ill? Were you cursed? Were you plotting against the bishop? So next time you eat quietly at your desk or on the couch with Netflix humming in the background, just remember, in the Middle Ages, dinner came with an audience and possibly a guy playing the lute 2 feet from your face. If medieval kitchens were unpredictable, then medieval road food was outright chaotic. Imagine setting off on a multi-week journey without a map, without clean water, and with a backpack full of dried meat, questionable cheese, and blind optimism. Let's start with the basics. Whether you were a pilgrim, peddler, soldier, or someone fleeing taxes, you needed food that was lightweight, compact, and wouldn't kill you mid-journey. There were no inns with menus, no snack stands, and if someone said room service, they probably meant rats. So, what did people pack? First, hardtack, also known as ship's biscuit or that thing that chipped my tooth. This was a rock-solid slab of baked dough, flour and water only, no yeast, no joy. It could last for months. sometimes years. You softened it by soaking it in ale, broth, or sheer desperation. Then came dried meat, often salted beyond recognition. Beef, pork, or fish were dried in strips or packed in salt barrels. Think jerky, but without flavor, texture, or moisture. Soldiers gnawed on these like a dog with a rawhide chew. Sometimes it took so long to eat a piece you forgot you hated it. Cheese was popular too, especially hard cheese. Soft cheese spoiled fast, but a nice aged cheese wrapped in wax or cloth that could last weeks, travel well, and serve double duty as a mild weapon. For the slightly better prepared, there was dried fruit and nuts, raisins, figs, almonds, walnuts, all dense in energy and low in spoilage. They could be tossed into a pouch and eaten mid-walk or mid-horseback without needing utensils, plates, or even dignity. And of course, ale or wine. Not just for pleasure. Often it was the only thing safe to drink. Water from roadside streams was iffy at best. Many travelers carried flasks of ale or diluted wine to hydrate. Yes, hydrate. You weren't drunk. You were preventing dysentery. Cheers. Now for soldiers, especially those on campaign, things got grim. Armies on the move didn't have supply chains like today. Food was local, scavenged, or stolen. When possible, commanders brought along mobile kitchens, carts loaded with grain, meat, beer, and cooks who didn't ask too many questions. Soldiers received daily rations, but these were wildly inconsistent. Sometimes it was a loaf of black bread and salted meat. Other times it was nothing but dried peas and prayers. During sieges, things got worse. Rats, shoe leather, or old hay became menu items. Some armies even roasted horse meat, though this was taboo in many regions, unless you were French, in which case you probably had a sauce for it. Pilgrims had it rough too. They often begged for food along the way or relied on hospices and monasteries, which provided meals, typically bread, soup, and weak beer, for those showing a scallop shell or other badge of holy purpose. Some walked for months with nothing more than a staff, sandals, and spiritual commitment, and hopefully a fig. Even merchants had to plan. Travel across Europe or the Middle East could take weeks. Markets were unpredictable. Inns were filthy or non-existent, so they packed their goods alongside sacks of grain, smoked sausage, dried beans, and maybe a pouch of luxury items, cinnamon, honey, or salt, for barter. And here's the fun part. Food often became currency. You could pay for shelter, passage, or protection with a chunk of meat or a rare dried apple. Salted fish was practically a medieval gold coin. So yes, travel food in the Middle Ages was minimalist, monotonous, and mildly hazardous. But it kept people alive, moving, and only occasionally hallucinating. And when you finally reached your destination, you'd celebrate the only way you knew how, by eating something that wasn't dry, gray, or moving. When we say kitchen today, we picture countertops, shiny pans, maybe a fridge full of mild guilt. In the Middle Ages, a kitchen was wherever the fire didn't immediately burn the ceiling down. Most medieval homes didn't have a kitchen as we know it. They had a fire, usually in the middle of the main room. No chimney, just smoke rising through a hole in the roof and into your eyes, hair, and every article of clothing you owned. So how did they cook? With improvisation, brute force, and a shocking tolerance for ash. The centerpiece of medieval cooking was the hearth. If you were lucky, it was stone-lined. If not, it was just a controlled patch of open flame that doubled as heating, lighting, and accidental hair removal. Hanging over the fire was a cauldron or pot, suspended from a hook or trivet. This was where the magic happened. Stews, porridges, pottages, and anything you could throw in a liquid and forget about for 6 hours. Bread was baked in community ovens or in clay pots covered with hot coals. Some people used clamp ovens, little domes of clay or brick heated with fire, then swept clean and stuffed with dough. The result? Bread that was somehow both burnt and raw. Delicious. If you wanted to roast something, say a rabbit, or what you hope was a rabbit, you used a spit over the fire. Meat was turned manually, sometimes by children, sometimes by trained dogs. Yes, really. Turn-spit dogs were a thing. Other times, it just sat there and was periodically rotated by whichever relative had the least seniority. Baking and boiling were the two main methods. Frying, not common. Oil was expensive, and pans were rare. Grilling, possible, but mostly accidental, and there were no timers. You cooked until the food looked done, smelled safe, or until someone passed out from hunger. Spices and herbs were added cautiously. Salt was vital and expensive. Most seasoning came from onions, garlic, leeks, or whatever green stuff you could forage without starting a feud with a neighbor's goat. And then there was smoking and drying, essential for preserving meat. Fish and pork were hung in smokehouses, sometimes over indoor fires, meaning your house doubled as both kitchen and jerky factory. If your ceiling beams weren't coated in years of cured sausage grease, were you even living? Richer homes had dedicated kitchens, separate buildings, usually stone, to prevent the rest of the manor from burning down. These had multiple hearths, cauldrons, ovens, and servants who specialized in the fine art of not setting things ablaze. In castles, cooking became an organized system. You had a master cook, scullions, pantry boys, spicers, and sauciers. They worked in shifts, shouted a lot, and probably lost track of whether the venison stew was from this week or last Thursday. Some kitchens were so large they required fireproof floors and constant ventilation, plus an entire staff just to chase out rats. But the core truth remains: most medieval cooking was humble, practical, and smoky. Whether in a one-room cottage or a barren stone-walled kitchen, people worked with what they had: a fire, a pot, and the hope that whatever was bubbling inside wouldn't come back to haunt them. So next time your stovetop acts up, take a breath. At least your cooking doesn't involve boiling stew over an open flame while squinting through smoke and dodging goats. If you thought medieval food was rough during normal times, just wait until everything fell apart. Because in the Middle Ages, when famine, plague, or war arrived, which was often, the dining experience turned from barely edible to barely imaginable. Let's start with famine. Crops failed regularly from drought, floods, pests, or simply bad luck. A couple of weeks of unusual rain, and boom, the grain rotted, the bread ran out, and suddenly the price of peas skyrocketed like they were NFTs. In times of scarcity, people turned to substitute foods. These included things that technically contained calories, but should not have been near a cooking pot: tree bark, acorns, nettles, weeds, and animal bones, boiled over and over to draw out phantom nutrients. Some made a paste from ground roots and moss, pressed into cakes and baked until barely chewable. Then there were the darker moments. Historical records from bad famines speak of people eating shoe leather, sawdust bread, or even resorting to, well, not entirely legal meat sources. We'll leave it at that, because this is still a bedtime story. But let's just say, desperate people do desperate things. Now on to plague. The Black Death hit Europe in the 14th century and wiped out nearly a third of the population. It didn't just kill people, it collapsed food systems. Farmers died, markets shut down, trade routes were abandoned. Monasteries, which often fed the poor, were decimated. Those who survived the plague often found food prices skyrocketing. If you were rich, you could hoard. If you were poor, you begged or stole. But here's the bizarre part. In between waves of death, some people threw feasts. Massive, wild, dance-on-the-table kind of feasts. Why? Because when death seems certain, what's a little extra cheese between friends? Some saw it as a last hurrah, others a spiritual obligation. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow the rats return. Food also took on magical and superstitious value. Some believe certain herbs, spices, or even colors of food could ward off illness. People chewed on garlic, burned aromatic herbs, or consumed blessed bread distributed by clergy. Was it effective? Not really, but it helped psychologically, which in those days was sometimes all you had. And then there was war. Sieges were the ultimate food test. Trapped inside city walls, people would ration, stretch, and eventually devour anything that moved slower than a cat. Horses, dogs, rats, even the leather from saddles and belts became chewable. Imagine boiling your boots for soup. Now imagine sharing that soup with your neighbor and pretending it's hearty. Meanwhile, invading armies would burn fields, trample grain, or strip the land bare to feed themselves, leaving nothing for the locals. Food became both weapon and casualty. And yet, people adapted. They stored dried beans in hollow walls, hid flour in secret compartments, baked flatbreads over candle flames. Even in ruin, they found ways to survive through ingenuity, sharing, or sheer stubborn human will. And when peace returned, they celebrated the only way they knew how, with food. Fresh bread if they had grain, ale if they had malt, and stew, always stew, because it welcomed whatever ingredients they had and turned them into a meal, a statement, a comfort, a reminder we're still here. And so, dear listener, we've reached the end of our medieval feast. From gritty trenchers to gilded goblets, from peasant stews to noblemen's sugar castles, from cheese stored in cellars to hardtack gnawed beside muddy roads. We've wandered through the full, flavorful, and often questionable menu of medieval Europe. We've watched monks chew eel on feast days, peasants dodge punishment for poaching rabbits, nobles wave away forks with suspicion, and travelers pack enough dried meat to outlast a siege. We've seen how food was never just about survival. It was about status, faith, ritual, and above all, community. Whether you dined alone in a smoky hut or in a grand hall under candlelight, food was central to life and often to death. It connected people, defined classes, started wars, built economies, inspired poetry, and in some cases, very unfortunate stews. But even in its strangest moments, medieval food had heart. People used what they had. They cooked with instinct. They learned to stretch, share, savor, and sometimes settle for the least moldy chunk of cheese. So tonight, as you settle into sleep, full of imaginary trenchers and phantom cider, remember, the past wasn't always glorious or glamorous, but it was human. And like us, they ate, together, messily, hopefully, sometimes even joyfully. Thanks for joining this strange supper. If you enjoyed this sleepy little journey through history, give us a quiet like, tap subscribe, and we'll save you a spot at the next table. There's always more strange history to nibble on. Until then, sleep well, dream of figs and ginger, and may all your stew be fresh.